We mentioned a couple of weeks ago the orientation of a chassid as opposed to the orientation of a tzaddik. Where the chassid, of course, is on a higher level. The tzaddik has a list of responsibilities, and as he goes through the day, he checks off the list, and if he, at the end of the day, has done everything that is required of him, then he's had a successful day. The chassid checks off the hours and the minutes. Did I spend every hour, every minute, doing something that would be, so to speak, pleasing to God? If you can check them all off, then he's had a good day. Now, there's a related issue here, which is a quite deep issue in Torah law and Torah thinking, and then there has certain implications for how we look at the idea of Hasidus. The Gemara in a number of places distinguishes two types of mitzvahs. In Hebrew they are mitzvah va'oseh versus eino mitzvah va'oseh. Or let me say it better. Eino mitzvah, comma, va'oseh. Some things you are commanded to do, meaning Kodesh Baruch Hu gives you an order, do X, and also says, if you don't do X, then there'll be a penalty. I'm forbidding you to omit it. The other category is where Kodesh Baruch Hu invites you to do X, and you'll get a reward if you do it, but if you omit it, there's no penalty. So you could, in English, call the first ones obligatory, and the second ones voluntary. Now, if you ask people, which would you consider to be the more important, worthy of more reward, more noble, more precious, more valuable?
The one who's not commended.
I'm sorry?
The one who's not commended.
Right. That's definitely the answer that will be presented on the basis of intuition. What you volunteer to do, so to speak, shows your character. It shows your nobility. It shows your values, your commitments. When you get an order, it could be that you're just obedient. You do what you're told. The other is much more meaningful. That would be the natural thought. But the tradition is unanimous that the truth is the opposite. That the commanded ones, the obligatory ones, mitzvos, are more important, more meaningful, more valuable, and you get a bigger reward than the voluntary ones. Gottleib mitzvah v'osa, mimisha en mitzvah v'osa. And the question will be, why is that? Since it goes against our intuition, we have to understand why our intuition is wrong. There is a Tosfos. I think of this as a very modern Tosfos, because we have exactly the same problem today that Tosfos had 800 years ago. And they say that whenever a person is commanded to do something, there's a certain resistance, a certain natural resistance. Don't tell me what to do. Don't give me orders. Don't force me. And since there's resistance, in order to do such a mitzvah, you have to overcome the resistance. And we have a general rule, from Tzara Agra, the more effort you have to make to do the mitzvah, the more reward you get for doing the mitzvah. So, Eino mitzvah va'osa, voluntary mitzvahs lack a certain resistance that obligatory mitzvahs have, and therefore, in that respect anyway, the reward for doing an obligatory mitzvah will be bigger than the reward for doing a voluntary mitzvah. That's one explanation. There's another explanation found, if I remember correctly, in the Ritva and in the Maharal, where you take a look at the action you're performing. In particular, take a look at it in psychological terms, and ask, in which type of mitzvah are you more representing God, and which type are you more representing yourself? So, let's take an obligatory mitzvah. There the person says, God commanded it, so I do it. I'm obligated to do it. I'm fulfilling my obligations, which come from God, and that's why I'm doing it. That could be the whole of the motivation. You don't need any more than that. But in a voluntary mitzvah, that can't be, because God isn't commanding it. God is simply saying, I invite you, I'm offering you a reward, but if you don't take the invitation, no penalties, no losses. So when he does the voluntary mitzvah, the story can't be, well, God commanded me to do it, so that's why I do it, because he didn't command you. So what is the story? The story is, I find this inspiring. I find this to be developmental. I find it to be an expression of my highest priorities. You hear the same word in the three sentences? What word did appear in all three sentences? I find, I feel, I am. Right? In other words, in the case of the voluntary mitzvah, it's expressing something about myself that motivates me. Well, that makes you less singly representative of God. You have a double agenda. Of course, you do believe in God. You do it in part because God says so. But in addition to that, there's something in you that it expresses, and that's important to you, and that's what you do. That's part of the reason that you're doing it. So the fact is that the obligatory mitzvos define you as a representative of God in a way that the voluntary doesn't. Because the voluntary mitzvos, in part, come from your own sensibilities, your own sensitivities, your own inspirations. And now, if our project in this world is to represent God in the world, the obligatory mitzvos carry that representation much more strongly than the voluntary mitzvos. I'll give you the extreme of this idea, although it isn't in the context of mitzvos. But the verse says about Moses that God says, I spoke to Moses mouth to mouth. Now the clever critic says, last time I checked, if you're speaking with your mouth, you speak to the other guy's ear. You don't speak to his mouth, not mouth to mouth. You know, this isn't CPR. So the deeper sources say it means that when Moses spoke, it was God's voice coming out of his mouth. It means that he made himself into a vehicle for expressing God's words, and there was nothing him in it. It was just God's words. It's as if the Shekhinah was speaking from his throat. That's the ideal. The ideal is not, well, yeah, God inspired me, but I figured out how to say it. You know, keep me in the picture, guys. I made a contribution. I helped tweak the message, and it's partly my message. No, the greatness of Moses is that none of it was his message. He was wholly a vehicle just for communicating God's message. You know, I'm thinking of this now. I haven't used this before, but maybe this is a good analogy. Suppose someone says, please give this message to so-and-so. He gives you the words, but you have to speak it. You will be interpreting it automatically by the way you speak it. The tone of voice, the speed, the emphasis. It's inevitable. So what the other person gets is a compound of a partnership. The original person chose the words, and the communicator, the one who's bringing the message, himself put the feeling into it. With Moses, there wasn't anything like that. It was just God's voice speaking from his throat, and that's the higher service, because there's less of you in it. Now, this reflects the following principle in almost all cases. If you have a choice between two mitzvos, both of which apply to you, and you can only do one, if one is obligatory and one is voluntary, you should do the obligatory one. because it's the higher service, because there is a greater reward, that's the one that you should choose. This is all agreed upon without any question, as far as I know. Now let's go back to the idea of Hasidus. When I set myself every day, all day long, hour by hour, minute by minute, to do something that's pleasing to God, is it possible that in every case I should do something that I'm commanded to do? I think the answer is maybe sometimes, but maybe other times not. And maybe like study of Torah, which I am committed to do, but that may be impossible. So I choose to do something else. And there are mitzvahs which are voluntary. So, for example, let's take the Sukkah, business Sukkah, living in the Sukkah. If you're going to eat bread, if you're going to eat for some a cake and drink wine, you have to do it in the Sukkah. What about eating an apple? So it's praiseworthy to eat the apple in the Sukkah, even though you're not required to do it. You're not ordered to do it. Now, that means you take the apple, you go into the Sukkah, you make a blessing. During that period of time, you're not sitting in the yeshiva learning. If it weren't Sukkahs, you could have, and it's a base medrash, not a base Knesset, you could have the apple with you in the base medrash, and while you're learning with your friend, eat the apple, and not interrupt the learning. But it's Sukkahs, it's valuable to go into the Sukkah and to do what is a voluntary mitzvah rather than an obligatory mitzvah. Why is that? If the obligatory mitzvahs are more important, in a conflict situation, you do the obligatory mitzvah, the amount of reward you're going to get is greater for the obligatory mitzvah. Why would you ever sacrifice an obligatory mitzvah for a voluntary mitzvah? Why would you ever do that? Now, the Nesiv Shalom, the set of Svarim of the previous Slonimer Rebbe, the Chassar of the Bracha, he addresses this point. And he says that although on a one-by-one basis, an obligatory mitzvah is more important than a voluntary mitzvah, but to have a life that is wholly missing voluntary mitzvahs isn't appropriate either. It isn't appropriate either. Why isn't it appropriate? Because of the reason that we mentioned before, just put the same idea, a little slightly different words. If I see a person doing an obligatory mitzvah, it is appropriate, reasonable for me to say his motivation is he does what God commands. God's created the universe, and God has given an enormous amount of benefits, and he's filled with God's authority and his hakaras hatov, his gratitude to God, and that's what he's doing. He's acting that out. When I see him do a voluntary mitzvah, that can't be the whole explanation. Part of it is this opportunity thrills me. This opportunity motivates me in and of itself. I want to be close to God. And I want to be able to show that I appreciate it. And not just that I'm obedient. Not just that I do things that I'm duty bound. I don't violate my obligations. No, it's not just that. It's important that your spiritual life should have in it some of that aspect of serving God. Now, one place where you could see this brought to classical source, of course, I'm using these things. I'm not saying the people who wrote these classical sources say my idea, but they say something. It seems to me that it's directly relevant. When we received the Torah at Sinai, it was a multi-stage process. And two of the stages are this. We received the Torah on the 6th of Sivan. On the 4th of Sivan, 2 days earlier, God had Moses ask the Jewish people, do you want the Torah or not? And we said, yes. Na'aseh v'nishma. We do want it. So that was a voluntary acceptance of the Torah. On the 6th of Sivan, when God actually revealed himself, it says, Kovel and Harkigis, he held the mountain over their heads and said, if you accept it, fine. If not, your career is over here. So the commentaries ask, Shonim and Achronim, why do you need both? Why do you need both? And, like in any question like that, you can ask it two ways. If I have A, why do I need B? If I have B, why do I need A? If they've already pledged themselves voluntarily to accept the Torah, why then do you have to hold the mountain over their heads? They already said yes. And on the other hand, if you know that you're going to hold the mountain over their heads, so you know that you are going to express coercion, why bother going through the play acting of the voluntary acceptance if you're not going to rely on that? You're not going to be content with that. You're going to threaten them. In addition to that, why bother? And the commentaries do talk about both halves of the extra. The Maharal says the reason why we don't rely only on the voluntary acceptance is because if you did, you would create a false impression at the basis of your understanding of our relationship to the Torah. Imagine that God says on the 4th, do you want it? Don't you want it? They'll say, yes, we do want, we'll do it. And on the 6th, God just reveals himself without holding the mountain over their heads. 100 years later, 200 years later, you ask a Jew, why are you doing what you're doing? How did it come about? Where did it come from? He may tell you, listen, the creator of the universe offered us an opportunity. And we took it. And that's why we have it. 100 years later or 200 years later. Says Maharal, but that's wrong. Because from the beginning of the creation, history was set up to lead to the Jewish people receiving the Torah at Sinai. And if they hadn't, the world would have collapsed. This is the justification for there being a world, that the Jewish people received it at Sinai. So it simply isn't true that we have it because we volunteered for it. So God holds the mountain over their heads and says, ultimately, you would have had no choice. Ultimately, it doesn't rely only on your choice. Ultimately, it's because I'm demanding it. And let's understand that the creator of the universe doesn't have to ask for your voluntary acceptance of his commandments. Indeed, in the whole history of all the commandments that God gave to various people, this is the only case where he asked for and received a voluntary commitment. God commanded Adam, and through him all the human race, in various mitzvahs. And Abraham had extra mitzvahs. Jacob in Egypt, God commanded him to offer the Paschal sacrifice and to do bris milah. He didn't say, do you want these mitzvahs? Don't you want these mitzvahs? There was no voluntary. The creator of the universe doesn't have to ask permission. So, says Maharal, the reason he held the mountain over our heads was to correct that misimpression. And no, it's a necessity. It's not really based on your free acceptance. Well, if that's true, then the opposite question comes marching back in. If so, why bother going through the voluntary acceptance? This I haven't seen addressed in the form that I'm going to answer it, but I think the answer is correct, and from that answer you'll get an insight to what we've been talking about, the way Hasidus works and all the rest. If there had been just holding the mountain over their heads, then the residue for history would be that we're doing it because we were commanded. Okay, and the creator of the universe doesn't have to ask permission. He commanded, and we're obligated. But the truth is that they were so transformed and inspired by the miracles that took place in Egypt and the miracles that took place in the context of the Exodus, that the opportunity to dedicate themselves wholly to God's service was in fact something precious to them. And it's important for us to know that. It's not just obedience duty, responsibility. But there's a precious opportunity when they volunteer, Nasa v'nishma. When we study that history and we think, just a few weeks ago they were slaves, and they've been slaves for 90 years. Wouldn't it be natural for a slave to say, "Give me a break. Let me spend a few months at the beach. Another project, another absolute commitment, day and night." The fact that they jumped at the chance, volunteered to the chance, means there's an element in the Torah that's precious. And now, when I hear that, I think to myself, well, they lived through it, and they saw this. If I don't see it, I'm missing something. It's there. They weren't hallucinating. It's just that I'm not getting it. So, the expression of it is very important. That's what Ein Mitzvah also does. When you volunteer to do a mitzvah that you're invited to do, you do it on the basis of the fact that you see it as valuable. It's your understanding, it's your values, not just submitting to a higher will, submitting to a higher authority. That's a very important part of a person's spirituality. It's not something which is should be ignored entirely. Yes, in normal circumstances, if you have an obligatory mitzvah and a voluntary mitzvah, and you can only do one of them, do the obligatory mitzvah. But that your life should be wholly obligatory and never voluntary, that's something which is not 100%. It's not really appropriate. The Ramban says that negative commandments express awe and fear of God, and positive commandments express love of God. My Rebbetzin told me a few times since we're married, I haven't seen it inside, but Maharal says that one difference between positive and negative commandments is that the positive commandments are motivated, as in Ramban, are motivated by love. Non-Jews have no positive commandments. They're all negative. Except for establishing justice, which is an absolute necessity for a society to function. They have no positive commandments. They don't have to do anything. Because that a non-Jew should get to the level of love is absolutely extraordinary. It's not their medium of relating to God. Their medium of relating to God could be fear and awe, which are very valuable, precious media of relationship, but it's not like love. So what the Chassid is really doing is setting his relationship with God, relationship with Torah, to express love of God. The tzaddik is more expressing awe and fear. He has the rules. He's making sure that he can check off each of the rules. Doesn't want to leave anything out. He wants his actions to be right actions. That's not yet on the level of serving God out of love. So, when we say that the Chassid is trying to please God and he checks off hours rather than mitzvos, there's a deeper element here. The deeper element is that he's expressing love and the preciousness of the opportunity to be able to serve God, rather than simply, it's objectively necessary, I have to do it, and I live up to my responsibilities. One place where you see this in very dramatic form is Kiddush Hashem. Let's suppose performing mitzvos carries a threat of death. The non-Jewish authorities and powers said if a Jew performs a mitzvah, then he's going to die. So the various conditions, and it would take more time than I have to, and probably more understanding than I have to explain in detail exactly when and how you're obligated to give your life or not obligated to give your life. But there is a machlekes in the Rishonim whether under conditions where there's a threat of death and the Torah doesn't require a person to die. The Torah says it is perfectly permissible for a person to violate the mitzvah and live. For the vast majority of mitzvahs, that's the rule. You're not required to die to put on tefillin. You're not required to die to keep kosher. You're not required to die to keep Shabbos. Only 3 small categories where you are obligated to die. So let's imagine that the non-Jewish authorities are putting pressure on the Jewish people with respect to one of these mitzvahs, which you're not obligated to die for. Can you volunteer to die? Rambam says no. The Rambam says in any case where you could save your life and you don't, that's equivalent to committing suicide. And suicide is murder. It's murder. Just like killing somebody else is murder, killing yourself is murder. So the Rambam, you can't do that. For other Rishonim, you can. For other Rishonim, you can. The classic case is where the Goyim surround a group of Jews and they say, give us a Jew to kill or we'll kill all of you. So under those conditions, it's forbidden to hand anybody over. And if you stop there, then the only alternative is that all the Jews should be killed. But what happens if one Jew says, I'll volunteer? So Rambam says you can't do that. The other Rishonim, many other Rishonim hold that you can do that. There are cases in the Gemara where something looks like that was done. There is a superb opportunity to show love of God by giving up your life when you're not obligated. Part of the motivation for doing it is to express this idea that living a life of Torah is not just a matter of obligation. It's a precious opportunity. And that should be part of a person's spiritual life. So the Hasidic movement definitely stressed that. The idea of setting yourself to act in such a way that, so to speak, pleases God. And why? Not because I'll get more points, not because my reward in the world to come will be a greater reward, but because since I love God, the opportunity to do something for someone you love is a precious opportunity. It's a moment of joy. And to express that, to show that that's part of what you're going on, and to reinforce it in yourself, is definitely appropriate. So the Nesiv Shalom says that from time to time, a person should do some voluntary mitzvah. Some voluntary mitzvah. Not just the obligatory mitzvahs. Even though, individually, the obligatory mitzvahs are more central than the voluntary mitzvahs. Maybe I can make an analogy here that will give it a certain open, obvious feeling. In marriage, there are obligations between husband and wife. You imagine a husband or a wife who says, listen, I'm getting married, I'm learning those obligations. I want to do what's right, And then says, okay, here I come into the marriage. I know what I have to do. These are the things I have to do, and that's it. The whole relationship is what I have to do. That's tragic. You might just be dealing with someone with whom you have a business agreement and living up to the requirements of the agreement. That's what the kind of marriage that you have. You have a real relationship with the other person, especially if it's a love relationship, then you'd be looking for things to do to show the love that you have for the other person. Now, this is a very important part of the relationship that you have with God. And Hasidus did stress this, did emphasize this. There's another feature of Hasidic life, which I want to briefly describe, though it's a very deep, and that's the idea of the group, the Hasidic group. Many activities occur with the whole group together. Now, I say the whole group together. Baruch Hashem, today, there are cases where the whole group together is just an impossibility, because you're talking about tens of thousands of people, and they're not going to rent a giant stadium for every time they get together to pray. But then there's subgroups, and there's an effort made that it should be hundreds of people together, should be in the context of a group, especially when Rabbi is present. People come from all over the world, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, or other times during the year for each particular Hasidus when they get together as a group, and special arrangements are made, places are rented, or they put expansions onto their buildings to hold the crowds during that time. They take them down. What's the idea? Why is doing things together, a group, such an important idea? So there is a Chazal, B'rova Mahadras Melech, with the multitude of the people, there's the glory of the king. By the way, just so you should know vocabulary-wise, rov sometimes means majority and sometimes means multitude. And you have to be careful about that. Multitude doesn't have to be a majority. And it's not being more than half. That's the issue. The issue is that you're experiencing something in the context of a group of people, and you're sort of, in a certain sense, you're dwarfed. You're simultaneously dwarfed and elevated. This goes back to what we spoke about in terms of Kain v'Hevel, joining yourself to something bigger than yourself. On the one hand, when you consider your contribution to the joint effort, sometimes it's minuscule, sometimes it's so small that you couldn't even measure it. On the other hand, by contributing to this joint project, which has a great goal, you now become a partner in achieving that goal. So that's not trivial. That makes your participation much more important than it would have been had you simply been a bystander. You know this in penalties. If 10 people pick up a rock that weighs 100 pounds and drop it on somebody and kill him, according to many positions, they're all guilty because they all killed him. You'll tell me, 10 pounds? Come on. Any 6 of them could have done it. Any 4 of them could have done it. Yeah, they could have. That's true. But they didn't. All 10 picked up the rock simultaneously and dropped it. They're all participating. They're all liable. That's on the negative side. All the more so on the positive side. So, the fact of being together with a group gives what you do a different significance, because it helps. Here's something which I only came to fairly recently. Not only are you present where there's Rov Am, and therefore the presence of the king is felt, but you're helping to create the Rov Am. You're one of the participants. When they count up the number of people there, you count for one. So you're bringing God's presence in that way. The Mishnah Perkei Avos says that if a single person will learn Torah, the Shekhinah is with him. And for 2, and for 3, and for 5, and for 10. So the attentive reader says, gee, you already told me 1. Of course, 2, 3, 5, and 10. There's just more ones. So in each stage, the Mishnah tells you what's special about having an extra person. The extra element in 10 is a bit shocking. It says, if any of 1 through 9 people get together to learn, that will bring God's presence. But when 10 people are getting together to learn, God comes first. He comes first and waits for the people to arrive. That's how precious it is. So when you go with a minyan to pray, to learn, whatever it is, when you go with a minyan, you're bringing God's presence. You're not just experiencing it because it's there. That's a gigantic opportunity. In a certain sense, all we are doing in this world is to bring God into the world. When we do His mitzvahs, we're representing Him in the world. Atem Eidai, you're my witnesses, your lives are testimony to me. So in the Chassidic movement, these events take place in a public setting with a gathering of people, because in that way they participate in bringing God's presence into the event, and the more they are there, the bigger that effect is. And that will be true even if they're strangers. Sometimes at funerals you have, in this country, I was at a funeral that had 250,000 people. But now they're not strangers. They're all followers of a single teacher, a single example. That means they share priorities, they share basic perceptions of the world, they share basic attitudes towards the world. This means that you're, how can I put this? If somebody asks you what you stand for, so you could list your principles. But if you can name a group and say, I'm one of them, I stand for what they do, that's a much bigger statement. The one is only autobiographical, and the other is, there's something going on in the world, and I'm participating in it. The Hasidic movement gave that attitude towards a Jew. Now, I think that attitude should be present whether you belong to the Hasidic movement or not. It should be in your understanding just because you're Jewish, because that's the way the Torah functions. But when you have it lived in a miniature, where you're directly involved, you know the people, you know the Rabbi, and you know what they stand for, and you participate in joint efforts, it's a much, much different expression. There are public charity projects. There are soup kitchens. Places where people can go and get food and help of any kind. Usher Freund, Cedar ran such a institution on his own. My Rebbe had an instance where this happened. Someone said, there's a young girl who needs a place for Shabbos, and your name was suggested to us. Can we bring her over? Yes. Rebbe's very hospitable. 2 people come with this girl, and they show her to the door, and they walk away and leave. They didn't identify themselves. They didn't identify the girl. They gave no information about her. Turned out that she had serious psychological problems. Serious psychological problems. Cans couldn't be on the shelf, cans of food, because they radiate bad rays. And so she had to take all the cans and put them on the floor. And other things like that. Books have to be piled up in the corner because they're not allowed to be sitting sideways. And it was a real Shabbos, So after Shabbos, the Rebbe said to herself, what am I going to do? What am I going to do with her, And she asked the neighbor, and the neighbor said, call Reb Asher Freund. Who's Reb Asher Freund? He runs a soup kitchen. He runs a hostel. He runs halfway houses for people who need help and need guidance. He has drug detoxification. He has a whole network. All his own project. She calls up and she says, I have this girl and she has these problems. You know what the answer she got was? Do you have enough money to pay for the taxi? If you don't, we'll pay for the taxi. Send her. Period. Now, everybody gives money to Sukkah, right? If somebody that works for that institution comes to my door, I make out a check, or I give them cash, and I pay. That takes 5 minutes. But if you're there serving out the soup, if you're there making the beds, if you're there tracking down someone who escaped and has to be brought back because they're in a psychotic state where they have to run, you're participating in the chesed in a much different way. It's a much different way. I don't know if you've heard of Partners in Torah. Partners in Torah is an international effort where anyone who wants to study Torah with a frum person can call up and get a partner. They have a bank of people who have already volunteered, and you set up like once a week or twice a week, whatever time you have, and these partnerships go on for years. Of course, it has an effect on the person calling up because, first of all, where do you get a commitment like that? Once a week? For years? For nothing? And second of all, although it's advertised as learning Torah, they're people, and the people talk to one another, and if they have a crisis or they have a problem, they talk about that. So it has a tremendous effect. Now, there's the Kiruv movement. Everybody's heard of the Kiruv movement, and everybody's impressed, and everybody thinks it's a worthwhile thing. 1 hour a week, and you can participate in it. You say, well, I'm nervous with people, and I can't open my house, and my kids don't make a good impression over this. So you spend 1 hour a week on the telephone. That's all. But now you're a participant. You're not sitting on the sidelines. Hasidus wanted people to feel like they're participating, not just sitting on the sidelines. It's certainly not isolated. So this is one of the elements of the group activities. To the extent, I personally find this very difficult to relate to, and I don't practice it, but to the extent that in some groups, and Simchas Torah, only the Rabbi dances with the Sefer Torah. Everybody else is in the paranchas, the stands, the standing areas where they can look down onto the floor. They sing, and they clap, and they may be jumping up and down on it, but they don't dance. They don't dance on the floor, and they certainly don't hold the Sefer Torah. There, by the way, this practice goes back to the temple. Because in the temple, on Sukkot, they had Simchas Beis Shoeva, where the greatest scholars would dance, jugglers, they would juggle fire, juggle knives, and everybody else was watching. I assume they were singing, the Levim were playing music, and they were watching. But that requires a really strong identification. He's doing it. He, or in the case of Simchas Beis Shoeva, they are our leaders. They're the ones who are inspiring us, the ones who we want to emulate, and they're expressing their joy. And I'm uplifted by being there and observing that. That's a case of Rova Mahadras Melech. That's a case where the group gives an expression to your identity and reinforces your identity in a very important way. This is another element of the Chassidic movement, which is really very fundamental. I can't think of any Hasidus that doesn't practice it. The idea of doing things in a group setting as much as is practical. Okay.